Hello and welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. I'm really excited. We've got a guest today, Azryah Harvey, who's going to talk to us about ethnicity, race, anti-racism, and the sort of whole discussion around that. And I'm sure the more questions will come as we start talking. So first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
No problem at all. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, as always, as always. So I would like to first ask you, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Of course, yeah. So my name is Azryah Harvey, and I am a qualified primary school teacher. I work predominantly with special needs, so social, emotional, mental health needs. Um, and I also work in equity and anti-racism. And so at present, I am currently working as an anti-racist consultant and trainer with a company, and we go into schools, primary schools, secondary schools, sixth forms, and we work with the staff and the pupils around improving their racial literacy.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's really what we're here to talk about, is that sort of education around racial literacy. I suppose that first of all, and I suppose it's a question that I feel like I think I know the answer to, but it's just actually as you said it, I thought actually that's just a question that's popped into my head. Why? I feel like maybe it's loaded, but I'll just ask it anyhow. Why do you think there is a need for this? Because ultimately, you'd think that in the society we live in, when there is so much information out there, social media, traditional media, etc., why do you still feel there's still a need for this education around this? Because as a sociology teacher, we hear about the postmodernist argument, and there's sort of this death of these meta narratives around class, gender, and ethnicity. Why is there still need for us to be educated around it, particularly professionals potentially?
I think so. I was actually thinking about this last night. So I'll say probably like three things that I think. I think one, when you do this work and you go to schools, you realize that there's a pattern and there's like it's like a variation on a theme, but ultimately it's the same problems to every school you go to a different degree. Some might have more problems than others, but I feel like there's like a group of issues regarding racism that you can pick from, and whatever school you go to, you will always see it. All of the problems are always picked for the same bag. So it's obvious that this isn't an issue that's rooted in one specific area or one specific demographic, because whether the school is predominantly white or whether the school is multi-faith, has loads of different ethnic groups, unless the school is aware and actively working to and promoting an anti-racist culture, you will have particularly pupils dealing with racism. And so I think it's obvious that this is a societal issue and not an issue with schools. And if it's societal, that means it's going to be generational. It means it's going to be between different demographics, different race ethnicities. And I think that speaks to the nature, which takes me on to my second point, the nature of racism, that it's like pervasive. It's in everything, everywhere, all the time, and depending on the day is going to be dependent on how you experience it. But I think people consider racism an issue for minority groups, but we all are impacted by racism differently. Some people are able to benefit off of it in ways. Even for me, example, I'm a fairer skinned black woman. So in some situations, I will I will be disadvantaged because of it. But in other situations, because I am fairer skinned, I will have an advantage. And so we all have to deal with racism. We all have to navigate and are impacted by racism. So I don't think it's a minority or ethnic minority issue. It is like a human issue. And so again, it affects everybody. And I think a school is filled with people from all walks of life, so it's going to be there. Um, and I can't remember my third. I forgot what I was going to say for my third point now. Um, but yeah, those are the two main ones I can think of. If I remember the third one, I'll bring it up. Um, and I think it's a safeguarding concern as well. So it's not just a case of, oh, we want to have a nice culture and we want school to like be fluffy and pleasant. Like, it's actually a safeguarding issue. We know, we've seen young children in primary school, children as young as like 10, being bullied, and children literally dying, and everyone around them who knew them knows that there's a racial element to it, knows that their race was a significant factor in that experience. But because schools and just generally society often don't like to talk about race and don't like to acknowledge racism as an issue, it never gets considered, and a lot of people never get justice.
So yeah, it's not just important from a sort of literacy point of view, as we've talked about at the beginning, it's also the impact that it potentially can have on young people in regards to safeguarding.
Yeah.
Obviously, you mentioned the word anti-racism, and we talk a lot about racism, nationality, ethnicity, and sociology. Not so much the word anti-racism. I was thinking about this and reflecting on that. I think when I first sort of met you, I thought to myself, I don't think I've ever used the word anti-racism. So, how do we understand the word anti-racism?
So I think the best way I can describe anti-racism is that it's active and intentional. So not being racist is just passive. Like you don't engage and you refrain and you know things are wrong and you don't do this and you don't say that. But anti-racism is no, actually, I'm going to hear this and I'm not just going to hear an inappropriate joke and just not laugh. I'm going to hear an inappropriate joke and let the person know, actually, that's not okay. And this is why. Or going into a school and being a part of a staff body and being in the staff room and hearing teachers consistently use certain words about certain children, or consistently see certain staff treat certain children a particular way, and you can see a clear pattern and you believe that it's a racial pattern. And instead of just making sure that you're not horrible to those same children, you advocate for them and you stand up for them and you point out where the staff might be doing something wrong. And so anti-racism is literally just that, is just active. And if you're not being active, then you're complicit and you're not really helping at all. So yeah, that's really it. Anti-racism is just like an active, intentional, very purposeful way of dealing with and looking at racism.
And I think what was interesting as well is I think it's recognising as well our own potential racism, which can be potentially quite
Yes.
difficult for us to have. And I think that was quite enlightening as well. I can talk about sort of my own personal example for myself, and I know I don't want to reference yours because that's for you to share, but as some people may know, I'm mixed ethnicity, and I sort of wanted to be, when I was younger, just the same as every other student. I wanted to have the same sandwiches as every other student. I didn't want my mum's packed lunches. And again, it's recognising, well, what was the belief behind that, even though I was very young. And I think sometimes, like you said, you think about minority groups, and it's only for that group of people, but not the group themselves doing it to themselves. Like I can only be representative of myself, but at that moment I was fulfilling racism on myself. So it's at that. And also I think we were talking about when we met was things that are not as very subconscious. So it's looking at things that potentially are quite difficult to look at, things like who are getting detentions more, who are getting rewarded more. And I know this is something we look at in sociology. And so I suppose that's where I sort of want to move it forward to, is talking us about the sociology teachers. I suppose as a sociology teacher, I think and I believe that I work in an anti-racist way. However, why might that... However, I suppose my question is, how can we ensure that as a teacher we are, I suppose, being fair to students in the curriculum, using it in an anti-racist way? Because I think there's this assumption that as sociology teachers, therefore we know what we're doing. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. That's what I was trying to word it, is that we're sort of like, it's a given that because we talk about race, ethnicity, in a lot of our lessons, that it's a given that we understand that. I suppose, what would be the recommendations or anything you could suggest that we could do to work on that further, to develop our literacy around that?
So I think, I can't remember like the technical word for it, but it's basically when it's what you would call a blind spot. And it's
Yeah.
when, because maybe you're from a particular ethnic group, maybe you have a relationship from someone with a particular ethnic group, maybe your children are mixed, or even because you know that you're a sociology teacher and you work in anti-racism, etc., you have blind spots, and it's kind of like you overestimate your ability to be unbiased. And so I think as long as you're aware that you have a blind spot, you can continue to interrogate. But if you don't recognize that you have a blind spot, you stop interrogating your own behavior, and it becomes harder for you to recognize like when you are actually contributing to a system you're like vehemently against, because we all suffer with bias by virtues of being human being. Like none of us can escape it. So I think it's just important to bear that in mind. And you need just as much as awareness as someone who's learning, as someone who's still, you know, really understanding how racism functions and words and language, etc. We still need to have that same level of like awareness and consistently interrogate our own behavior. I think what the difference would be is that it would be easier for us to well, it should be easier for us to interrogate our own behavior, because we kind of have an awareness of how bias works, and we recognize how bias impacts other people, etc. And we can kind of look for the signs. We know what it looks like when it's manifesting. And so just really bearing that in mind as you go through your practice, whether it's your lesson planning, because it can be to the point where you lean the other way, you start overcompensating, right? Because you're very aware of like the disadvantages and the bias certain demographics or certain peoples may face. And so you don't then want to lean to the other side and overcompensate, because then that also can make everybody uncomfortable. The children recognize like, oh, you know, miss, like I'm okay, like I understand, but like I'm fine. We don't want to start imagining more like oppression, or we don't want to start imagining more unfair treatment, etc., more than there is. So we need to be careful about that. And I think it's important to, in terms of having to do that, even if it's just one other individual, for that check and balance. Because sometimes as well, if you are very aware, if you are, you know, an anti-racist teacher and you work in a social science like sociology or psychology, and you are in a school environment which doesn't really nurture that and doesn't really value that in you, and you are aware of issues and you bring things up and you kind of get, you know, swatted away, and you get told like there's nothing really wrong, and it's all rationalized and explained away, it can be really difficult to maintain the morale that allows you to, you know, look at your curriculum and look at your lesson planning and really think about how can I make this inclusive and how can I make sure there's like representation. If you're doing those things and they go completely unnoticed, and not even in terms of necessarily reward, but someone acknowledging how important and how significant the work is that you're doing, and wanting to use that example and, you know, make it a school-wide thing, those kind of things that kind of remind you that what you're doing is important and necessary. If you lack those reminders from your superiors or from your peers at work, it can be really hard to maintain the morale. So I always encourage people, if you can just find just one other person who you can talk to, who you can vent to, who can support you, who you can bounce ideas off of, that's really helpful in kind of like maintaining that awareness and maintaining that kind of like that active anti-racist work. And also looking for, it's don't be afraid to look for places and move and do find places that are going to value the work that you do, where you can make a difference, where you're not going to be, you don't feel like you're fighting a losing battle. I think it's really important as teachers. I still think about my old pupils, and I left when did I leave? I left a year and a half ago now. I left my school, and sometimes I want to go back and see them, and I think it's right, you can't do that. They're not your kids, leave them alone. Teachers come and go all the time. But I still think about them, so it can be hard. But I feel like if you're in an environment where it's not conducive to not even just you professionally but even personally, because anti-racism isn't just about our job. If you're anti-racist everywhere all the time, right? It's a part of your lifestyle. And so do consider looking for places and being in spaces where you are valued and it's recognized and people are fighting the same fight as you.
Exactly. I think you sort of. I think there's one key point that you pulled, or lots of key points there, but one that you sort of said is that interrogation, and as well as also having someone that can to bounce your ideas off. And I think it's that part of that reflective practice. We've got lots of listeners and people in our sort of Facebook group that are either new to teaching or people that are experienced teaching. I think it's that constant interrogation, and I think as the nature of sociology as a subject, it is always changing. It is always negotiating what it means as a subject and its currency in modern day. I sort of want to make a sort of segue into the curriculum, and I know that obviously you've also got a background in sociology as well, hence the reason why I thought, oh, this is, also good to have these conversations, not only from sort of your consultancy role, but also as a fellow sociologist. By the nature, and I suppose my question is, how on earth do we teach stuff in social. I don't want to say how it is that we which seems to go against the anti-racism curriculum, because there's stuff in the sociology curriculum. I know some of it is outdated, stuff around sort of cultural deprivation sort of theory,
Mm.
but then we've got stuff that's more recent, which I know we've spoken about before, with sort of research from various sociologists, including Tony Swell, who talks about, and obviously he's not here to comment or anything like that, but we've got stuff that's out there that's saying like, institutional racism doesn't exist. You've got some really, I suppose, real sort of topical, hard debates in sociology, which are difficult. They're difficult to teach, and also on top of that, you've got it's not even outdated stuff. So you can't even say, well, there's a historical context to this. This is stuff that's been, how do we present that also in a non-biased way? Because obviously the point of sociology is to present a whole range. Although other listeners and other contributors have suggested it isn't that. But we're supposed to present a range of views, but ultimately some of them perpetuate historical beliefs that are maybe don't go along with the anti-racist curriculum. I'm sort of throwing it over to you. I'm sort of pondering, but love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think that it's interesting because my essay right now, it's not about sociology, but it's about the citizenship education curriculum, which is by nature sociological, as well as like political and all of those things. And I think that sometimes, like, as teachers, we feel like we have to have the answers and then impart the knowledge. And so if there's a piece of knowledge that we don't actually agree with, then we think, oh my gosh, how do we teach this? Because I don't believe that this is true, or I don't believe that this is safe. I don't believe that this is morally, right, etc. Like, how do you teach something like that? And I think in terms of it's what Jerome calls a deliberative classroom. And so it's about using certain things more as kind of like stimulus. And so you will propose something to pupils. And of course, there's a curriculum and there's exams and there's things that they have to learn. But there's also a way to do it where it's like, we need to know this information, but equally, we can look at whether it's problematic. If we come to the consensus that it is problematic, why, how did we get there? And just start kind of exercising, using it as almost like a critical thinking exercise. And you'd be surprised at how much they can recognize that. For example, if we look at something like freedom of speech, right, you'll have the argument that, freedom of speech, anyone should be able to say whatever they like, and if people get offended, then that's just essentially like a trade-off for having the privilege of being able to have freedom of speech. But then I was reading in a transcript, and you hear the pupils talk about it, and you hear them come to a consensus of to what degree is this okay, where does it cross the line, where are we tipping into where it's problematic, where it's dangerous, etc. And they don't necessarily all have the exact same opinion, but they're able to deliberate about it and come to a consensus and understand the concept and the theory of something, but also find a consensus that suits everybody that was in the conversation at that time. But then it's making them realize that these conversations are continuous. They don't, because context and circumstances will change. So maybe there may be half of the pupils in the room who maybe do agree with the problematic nature. By the end of the year, you come back to this conversation, you're maybe doing a recap, revising for an exam, and you throw out the conversation again. And in those 6 months, they're now deliberating again, now talking again. And you can see where the growth and the change has happened. And it's happened in that deliberative space, allowing them to think, allowing them to interrogate their own opinions. And I think it's hard because that requires time. And of course, you have to get through the syllabus, you have to get through the lessons, you have to get through, what is going to be on the exams. And that is what I think is most difficult. And then sometimes it's just about setting the tone and letting them know your expectations and saying, like, this is what I would like to do most of the time as your teacher, but I'm aware that we have, constraints and we need to focus on the exam period. And maybe, of course, optionally giving them that extracurricular time. So like sociology club, for example. I know it's probably not a thing.
Although
but
I have a sociology society.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I didn't have anything like that at
things.
school. Yeah, I didn't have anything like that at school. And so it's about, of course, using that extracurricular time as well. But I feel like it is really difficult because there's so many times in schools where you, for example, across whether it's English, history, like sociology, there's so many geography, there's so many subjects it applies to. And I think as well, teachers need to use what they have. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Like, you don't stress yourself out under things you can't control. For example, like the exam period coming up, you can't change the date of exams. You have a finite amount of time between the beginning of the year and exams. You're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do. That doesn't mean you're a bad teacher. It doesn't mean that you're not all good. Like, none of those things. It sucks that we have these limitations. And so again, working with someone, I think, is really good, because then you can say to each other, right, let's stick realistic, practical goals. What topics do we have this year coming up? What opportunities do we have? Where are we finding this an issue, and how can we use it in a way where it's not harmful, and it's kind of exercising those critical thinking muscles, and we're kind of interrogating and acknowledging where this is problematic and talking about that side of things. I think that is the most important thing, just finding meaningful moments. And over the years they'll accumulate, but it's hard. It is difficult. It's really hard. It's part of the reason why I left teaching, because I was like, I can't do this anymore.
I hear you. I know. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think I was just nodding like all the way through that, in the sense that there's so much in there that you sort of mentioned that was so valuable. I think you said the words was like moments, those sort of moments, and sort of that integrity, in getting students to reflect. I think there's also not only that, it's realising that it won't all be wrapped up in one lesson. I think people that may be new to sociology, or people who have come from a different subject, maybe, although their subjects, if it was humanities, would have done that. But like you said, it's that revisiting in that, and sometimes you can't be planned for that. I've noticed that, like, you sort of like I don't know, like you sort of sprinkle the idea and then you come back to it, and the students are considering it, reflecting on it. And I think you said those critical thinking skills are nurtured and developed throughout the year. And so they might have one view at one point, and then by the later point of the year, like you said, 6 months later, that view might be very different. But I suppose it's exposing those sort of views to students so they can digest that. And I think you use the word about safety. I know that people talk about in pedagogy psychological safety, but I think it's really making those, like you said, those expectations really clear to those students about what that means. So there was lots in that, and I totally agree with that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was sort of the concept of race, ethnicity, and national identity. I suppose I don't know if I am surprised. I suppose it goes back to my original question when I said to you, why is it still needed? There are still lots of students that come into sociology. Again, I suppose because of why I'm shocked more so nowadays, just because of the fact that in the past there wasn't social media, that still are confusing the words race, ethnicity, religion, and national identity. And obviously in sociology it's really important we know what those mean in order to understand the data that's presented in front of us, understand the debate, and understand race in terms of racism, because we understand that race is a social construction, but then racism exists. So race exists. You can't deny that race exists for the moment. We know that does exist, because there wouldn't be racism, although we know that it was constructed as a form of social control. My point is, how do we communicate to our students that effectively? What would be your sort of recommendation of working as a consultant? Because I find for some of those students, it is the first time they've heard it, so they're sort of open. We've also got students who have quite fixed views, misconceptions, I suppose, from social media around what that means. In some ways, I know we've had a lecture on before, and they've said that actually social media, although it's great and we're getting these debates and discussions, are actually taking students on a different tangent what they think that might mean. So how do we unpick that for our students? A lot of teachers will be teaching this in year 12, probably right now, at the beginning of the year 12 course. How would you suggest that we do that? It's a big question there.
Yeah, so the social media thing is interesting because, of course, the pupils are coming into this lesson, especially in year 12, with so many already like ideas and conceptions about race, what it means, how you use it to kind of like judge other people, again, consciously or subconsciously. They are going to come in by the time they're in year 12. they're going to come in with like a lot of stuff, particularly because the past however many years now, they've been forming their own identity. Before it was like, before when you're young, you don't see yourself as an individual. You see yourself as like your mom's child or someone, like you don't see yourself, as wholly as separate from your parents, for example. And then you get to a certain age and you start getting to 11, 12, 13, like puberty's happening now, your body's changing. So those periods before they come in and to discuss something like that's in year 12 makes you guys have like a whole load of extra stuff to deal with. Even when we talk about things like young black girls, for example, they've probably started doing their own hair now. Before, their parents would do it probably in protective style, so they'd put it in a style, it would be in that style for a week, parents would take it out, wash it, blow dry it, put it right back in. So now they're navigating, dealing with their hair maybe, and they're figuring out their hair, and they're figuring out what their hair means to other people and how they're perceived because of their hair. And so they're coming in with all of this stuff that has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with your lesson, but is going to impact it massively. So I think bearing that alone in mind, thinking about, actually, we have a massive task and a massive undertaking on our hands. We're not going to be able to reach everybody. There's going to be some pupils who already have, they're going to have different levels of understanding. We're not all starting at the same place, which again makes discussions very difficult to have if the position that we're starting from is not the same. We've got to figure out how do we make that an equal playing field for everybody. I think openness from the very beginning is very important, addressing the fact that some people may find this uncomfortable. Some people may have the urge to make it not uncomfortable by laughing, making silly comments. There's going to be some people in here who maybe do have ideas that aren't rooted in, a firm understanding. That's fine. We're going to get past it. And I think creating that openness, because having discussions about race can be is very difficult and is very uncomfortable. For different people in different ways. People have come to those conversations with different anxieties. You'll have pupils who are worried that someone is going to say something silly and it's going to upset them, get them angry, don't know how they're going to react. You're going to have pupils who are aware that they don't know very much and they're going to be worried about saying something wrong or saying something offensive or upsetting someone. You're going to have pupils who do have a certain level of ignorance and are going to purposely say things to antagonize and to irritate. And all of that going on is one conversation is a lot, and you're only one person. So I think that openness and setting a minimum standard for everybody and reinforcing it so that people know that it's kind of like non-negotiable, and when we're in this space and we're having these discussions, this is the expectation, I think is really important. Allowing them to lead some conversations. Again, we want to make sure we're mitigating, anything harmful. We want to make sure we're mediating, but ultimately it doesn't have to be our conversation. We can help them have a conversation. Again, I think as teachers, we often think like, okay, what do I need to say? What information do I need to impart? Like, what do they need to know leaving this room? But sometimes it's okay if they leave, with more questions than answers. You want them to have questions. You want them to, because that's important. That means they're curious. It means that they want to know more. It's when people are like, they think they know everything and, they don't have any questions and they don't want to engage. We want to really inspire kind of like that curiosity, and that interest and that engagement. So I think, definitely allowing them space. Again, time constraints, but even if it's just a starter, for example, at the beginning of the lesson, and you think about, it can be something from the previous lesson, it can be something related to the lesson coming up. You let them have a conversation, you listen, you gauge how much they know. Maybe you turns out they know loads and the lesson is actually quite, basic, and you can maybe go a bit deeper. And just having that, I think having that fluidity with discussions like this is really important, because at that age as well, they're going to be very capable of having discussions. They're 100% having these discussions anyway. They're 100% talking about these things anyway, whether it's with their family and whether it's something that's been a part of their family discussions, whether it's with their friends, etc. It will be coming up. So trusting them, to do that and having the ability to do that. And I think looking at the curriculum and making a plan, and thinking about what opportunities are we going to have this year coming up, which opportunities are really valuable, which opportunities can we absolutely not miss, and also ones that you may have not realized was an opportunity. You didn't realize it was relevant to the discussion, and you think, actually, if we approach this conversation in this way, that's going to give us a little bit more time on the topic. It's going to give us another perspective on the topic, and trying to do that with an additional person, one, so it takes the load off, because anti-racism stuff in the curriculum can be very taxing. And I find that when you really are passionate about it and you get into it, it's going to swallow up so much time. You're going to find yourself on the internet digging deeper and deeper in holes, and that, you can really get into it. So having someone to share that load with, and having someone to kind of like assess, talk over lessons after the fact. Is there anything we need to do? Is there anything that we shouldn't do or anything that we missed? And having that collaborative effort, I think, is so important, because even when at work, when we make materials, when me and Michaela sit down and make materials together, we can get through it so much quicker, because we're like, right. I missed something that she doesn't see, and vice versa. And I think it's a human thing, isn't it? Talking about race, it's very much about human connections and how we relate to each other. So I think in planning, that needs to be reflected in the planning, and having someone to do it with, and ask the pupils for their what they would like to talk about and what their ideas are, because they're always full of ideas, always bursting.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my gosh, again, so much in there. Like,
I
definitely
know.
working with someone, definitely working with someone. I think if you're one person department, history teachers, potentially reach out to them, the geographers. I'm not suggesting they're the only people, drama does lots of work. I
Yeah.
know that, there's lots of other departments within there. Again, giving the students time to reflect, what you said, and obviously, yourself. I think putting that ownership on the students as well, and finding out what they already know, which is something you said. I think if we go in with an agenda, sometimes the students already know. And also, I think, like you said, is the idea of being aware of your cohort and saying, like, we're all going to be at different stages, and that's okay, sort of normalising that. I think that gives those students that sort of, okay, I'm not
Yeah.
expected to be an expert. I found it quite useful, actually. There's two things I personally found quite useful. There's a unit called Culture and Identity, and I think I really like teaching it, because I feel that gives us the space and the time to really, there's lots of different identities we have to look at, and ethnicity is one of them. And it's not just brushed over. It's quite a significant amount of period of time. We can really delve into the social construction of ethnic identity, and we also look at race and nationality as part of that. So it might be a case, if you're really passionate about it, it's worth looking at different modules. That might be something that's for some of those teachers. In addition to that, with sort of looking at race and ethnicity and nationality, I think you said about that as enrichment activities are so important, allowing that time outside lesson time as well to sort of continue that discussion into that debate. I know that I found it quite useful to show students how it's moving by looking at census data and how we used to collect census data and how we're looking at it today. And I found that really useful, because I think it showed, it takes away, I suppose, not knowing it all, because the government doesn't know it all, as in the sense when they first recorded data, mixed ethnicity, for example, Asian would be just, I think it was just Asian, back in like the 1980s, so I'm showing my age now. And then more recently, they started to collect more data and be aware of different ethnic groups, and it's become more sophisticated and more comprehensive. So I think it's sort of knowing that we are going to grow, and I always say to them, the next census data collection will be different again, because people will have greater awareness and greater understanding, and know that it moves forward all the time. But there's just so much in there. I think, like I think you said, it's a big responsibility. It feels like sometimes it's a big responsibility for a sociology teacher, because I sometimes feel like you have to go,
because it's very personal, isn't it? I feel like there's certain subjects, like there's certain subjects that are just so personal, and like you just really do take it home with you, and it's on your mind. Like you'll have a pupil who will say, like, if a pupil gets a maths question wrong, right, or they don't understand something to do with, I don't know, physics or something, it's one thing. But then when your people says something and it makes you think about what is going on at home, or like, or you worry about a people and their self-image. Like there's so many things that can come up in sociology that like transcend the lesson and transcend like just the actual subject in school. And it's such a personal lesson. And I feel like people who are in stuff like, particularly like sociology, if you're in it for the long haul, it's because you really, really care and you really, really enjoy it. So it can get very like emotional, actually, teaching and talking about certain things with your pupils. A lot of stuff comes up.
Yeah, definitely. I know that I teach stuff or talk about stuff that's not going to be necessarily assessed, because I feel like there's a moral obligation, like that we need to just mention it. And then I would say, if you want to talk about it more, come to the Sociology Society, or do some further reading. Let me know the books you're reading. Like, I think we were just talking about the Enlightenment in sociology, and I was like, how do we know that was the Enlightenment? Are we suggesting that other cultures didn't have an Enlightenment period? Why do we not know about that in its sort of discovery? Why do we talk about Western 1800s, as that period. Appreciate it's not going to be assessed in the exam, but it's, like you said, there is an exam, we have to meet that, but making sure that the students given the opportunities to say, oh, if we want to discuss this more, or we can explore or research. There's those enrichment activities out there. And sometimes students, I find, that come in with stuff and do research themselves and bring stuff in, if you sort of create that environment as well.
That's so good.
Yeah, well, I think we find this from a lot of our sort of contributors that say exactly the same. That the students go off and find stuff out, or might be decide to do their EPQ on something that's not covered in the sociology A level. So thank you. I could talk to you forever. I think there's lots in there around sort of the role of sociology, in particular in relationship to anti-racism. Thank you for your time. If you've got any sort of, I know that we're sort of going to keep in contact, so if there are any sort of particular websites or books, I think if you can let me know, and I can post it on the Facebook page or anything like that. That for teachers that want to know more about it, that would be great. But thank you for your time, and all the best with your MA. Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm going to go and sort myself out, regather myself, and get on with it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.